Airstrike, slamming a government building in the city's Freedom Square. At least 10 people killed. And another strike hitting an apartment complex near a hospital.
And you should know CNN teams are live on the ground throughout the region tonight and here at home with reaction to the president's speech as well. CNN's Jim Sciutto is live for us in Lviv. Russia expert Jill Doherty is in Moscow. Phil Mattingly is in Washington, and Oren Lieberman is at the Pentagon for us. Let's begin, though, with CNN's Jim Sciutto in Lviv and Jill Doherty in Moscow. Hello to both of you. Jim, first up, Russia has shifted to an aggressive bombing campaign in Ukraine. Civilians are dying. Kyiv is bracing for really a more major assault. What is the latest?
I'm told by U.S. officials the latest U.S. intelligence assessment is that as Russia's war plan, its invasion plan, has hit obstacles, including strong resistance from the Ukrainian military, that it will use heavier firepower, more indiscriminate firepower as well. And that includes targeting civilian areas, sometimes deliberately. That's the view of the U.S. military at this point. We've seen evidence of that. I mean, the video that Pamela was just referencing there, that was an administrative building in Kharkiv, not a military target, hit with a devastating blast. And it's the expectation of the U.S. military that we're going to see more, not less of that, particularly because what we've seen so far, Don, is an attempt to encircle the cities, such as Kyiv, but not yet move in to the biggest population centers. And as Russian forces do, and that is the plan, you're talking about putting all that firepower in close proximity to millions of residents, millions of urban residents, and the possibility of urban warfare. Sadly, that's going to mean more civilian casualties. It's going to be really, frankly, an ugly reality in the days and weeks going ahead.
Yeah. And Jim, I know you've been paying very close attention to the president's first State of the Union. President tonight praising Ukraine's courage in this fight, but warned that the next few days and weeks and months are going to be bad, as you were saying here. Saying that Russia, will make gains on the battlefield. What do you think of that? They're going to make gains in the battlefield, but you said it's going to be ugly, and that is a reality. The president knows, and pretty much all of our intelligence and the folks there on the ground know as well.
They do, and this is the thing. This has already moved more slowly than Russia's expectations and the U.S. and NATO assessment of their plans and capabilities, and the fact that they frankly greatly outnumber the Ukrainian military. It's moved more slowly. We're almost a week in. The expectation was it would have been over by now, right? I mean, that was certainly Putin's hope. That hasn't happened, and the Ukrainian military is stepping up, and it's inflicting significant losses on Russian forces. However, if you look at the map, Russian forces are making progress, particularly in the south, and while more slowly in the east and the north, they are, as we were saying, attempting and amassing forces to encircle cities. So I think we have to have a realistic perspective on what's possible here. It remains a David versus Goliath conflict, the odds against the Ukrainians. That said, you certainly don't want to count them out, right? Because we've been surprised from their perspective on the upside a number of times just in the last several days. And we should note that Western support is still coming to them. They are still getting, the supply lines are open. They're still getting weapons that have proven devastating at times against Russian forces. These shoulder-fired Javelin anti-tank missiles and shoulder-fired Stinger anti-aircraft missiles have inflicted losses. Whether that changes the ultimate outcome, we don't know yet.
Jill, to you in Moscow now. Putin has worked really hard to divide the United States, but on the issue of Ukraine and going after Russia, the president got bipartisan applause tonight at the State of the Union. Do you think Putin expected the United States and the world to rally against him the way that we have all been seeing?
Well, certainly not the world, and maybe not the United States, because after all, I think, as he was preparing to have this war, it would appear that he didn't think that the United States and Europe would get it together. And I think, a very interesting thing about Biden's speech tonight was, of course, his rhetoric, but if you look at it, it was kind of like a strategy from the White House to make this very much Putin's war. and Putin's economy. This is not, Russia against NATO or some big issue like that. All of those phrases, Putin alone is to blame. And I think that's deliberate because, you have here in Russia some criticism. We don't want to overplay it, but we have had more than 6,000 people arrested as they go on the streets to protest. You've had some public letters to the president from some very prestigious, there's a university that's allied with the foreign ministry. 1,000 people from that signed an open letter to the president saying, please stop this war. So there is some criticism building. And it would appear that what the White House is trying to do is, leverage that. And again, economically, with all the sanctions and how it's hitting Russia and hitting average Russian people, and then militarily, as Jim was just pointing out, it's not working out the way President Putin wanted either.
Right. And Pamela, clearly the split screen tonight between, three places really, Russia, Ukraine, and Washington, D.C., where you are.
Yeah, that's right. There's a lot going here in Washington. Let's go to our CNN senior White House correspondent, Phil Mattingly. He is here with me, as well as CNN's Oren Lieberman at the Pentagon for us tonight. So, Phil, I'm going to start with you. President Biden spent the first 12 minutes of his address on Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and he made the point the moment we're in is bigger than just Ukraine.
And I think that's a critical point. Look, you focus on kind of the micro here. Obviously, a very direct message to President Vladimir Putin, very direct message to the Ukrainian people and the courageous effort they've put up to this point. But there's a broader point there that I'm told the president made clear to his aides he really wanted to make over the course of this speech. Take a listen.
When the history of this era is written, Putin's war in Ukraine will have left Russia weaker and the rest of the world stronger. While it shouldn't have taken something so terrible for people around the world to see what's at stake, now everyone sees it clearly. We see the unity among leaders of nations, a more unified Europe, a more unified West. We see unity among the people who are gathering in cities and large crowds around the world, even in Russia, to demonstrate their support for the people of Ukraine. In the battle between democracy and autocracies, democracies are rising to the moment, and the world is clearly choosing the side of peace and security.
And Pamela, I think, look, we've heard the democracy versus autocracy frame that the president laid out tonight many times over the course of the last 13 or 14 months. It's kind of a core message of both his campaign and his presidency. But it was the line, a couple lines before that, where he said it shouldn't have taken a tragedy like this to kind of rattle people, but now they're seeing it very clearly that I think the president really wanted to get across. There's an understanding inside the White House, and I think with the president, that they need to explain why the pillars of kind of Western democracy, of norms and laws that have guided almost the entire world for the better part of the last 8 decades have been asleep to some degree. And this is a moment that is jostling the West, Europe in particular, out of perhaps that slumber and recognizing kind of the essential element that those bring to the table and underscoring that the unity that you've seen from NATO, from the EU, obviously the U.S. alliance that they put together with the sanctions that they applied is so critical right now, given what we've seen over the course of the last 4, 5, 6, 7 years. And that more, even from a bigger picture perspective, is incredibly important going forward, and something that I think the president has long thought was lacking based on, in particular, his predecessor, but also just kind of the way the trajectory of the world has been going over the course of the last several years.
Yeah, just emphasizing that point. This is why we should care about upholding democratic values. And also he talked about the pandemic and how we're 2 years into this. He's clearly knows people are exhausted, right? And he talked about a reset. It was notable to me, though, he didn't make the same mistake he made July 4th of last year, where he said, declared independence from the virus. He tried to walk that fine line.
Lessons learned, I think
Lessons
would be a fair
learned,
way to
yes.
put that. And I think the White House is very wary of pivoting fully away from COVID. The president rejecting the idea of quote unquote living with COVID, but acknowledging people are frustrated, people are tired, people are exhausted. However, laying out very clearly that they believe they have the capabilities in terms of treatment options, in terms of dealing with the virus to move into a different phase, a phase that will actually be rolled out in detail tomorrow morning, administration officials say, which will lay out kind of the steps that they have taken, the treatments that they have, including the new idea that they're going to start rolling out tomorrow called Test to Treat, where if you go to a pharmacy, pilot pharmacies, you test positive, you can immediately get antiviral treatments. And so you're seeing the full scale of what the government has put into this is now available, a medicine cabinet, if you will, to actually deal with this. And while they're not saying it's over, it's done with, we're moving on, we're free from it, they're making very clear we can pivot from it. And if you wanted any evidence of that, look at the chamber.
Yeah,
no one was
exactly.
wearing a mask. And I mean, it was miraculous that it just happened 24 hours before the State of the
That's the
Union.
remarkable thing, because they pushed the date back, right?
Exactly,
to March 1st,
exactly.
the day in D.C.
But the
where battle-
overarching kind of picture they wanted to present is that the country is finally, carefully, moving on.
Moving on, moving forward. All right, Orrin, I want to go to you. Is there any update to forces that Russia has committed?
Well, Russia has, at this point, according to a senior defense official, committed more than 80% of this massive army, this massive force they had arrayed against Ukraine and around Ukraine and in occupied Crimea before essentially 1 week ago. So 80% of that has now crossed into Ukraine, more than 80% at this point. And some of that still remains outside of Ukraine, whether that's in Western Russia or in Belarus or in Crimea. But again, most of that has moved in. It has not been without problems for the Russians. They've had logistical issues. They've had sustainment issues. They've run out of fuel shortages, food shortages. It speaks to a bigger issue of logistics and sustainment problems that have slowed down this advance, as well as the very stiff Ukrainian resistance they have encountered as they've tried to move. You want to move an army of this size, you have to sustain it, and the Russians have not. Why they have made that mistake is a much more difficult question. Whether it's because they really thought this would be over in a matter of days, as Vladimir Putin seemed to think, or whether their leadership just isn't that good when it comes to military planning of an operation of this size. Regardless, that's the reality we're stuck with. Now, they're learning from it. A senior defense official says they will figure this out. They will solve their logistical issues, they will solve their sustainment problems, they'll solve their fuel shortages, and they'll be able to keep advancing. But so far, that massive column that spans some 40 miles outside of Kyiv has only moved about 5 kilometers, 3 miles, over the course of the past 3 days or so. Again, part of that is logistics and sustainment. Part of that is the Ukrainian resistance they're reaching. But a point here that every official makes is that Russia still retains a massive advantage in forces, and that's what gives them the advantage here. They still have an overwhelming force that they're bringing in that's moving into the country on a number of different fronts, that map you saw earlier, as well as some forces that remain outside the country. And that is what gives Russia that advantage.
All right, Orrin Lieberman, live from the Pentagon. Phil Mattingly, thank you both. Well, President Biden is taking aim at Vladimir Putin in his State of the Union address tonight, but is Putin listening?
6 days ago, Russia's Vladimir Putin sought to shake the very foundations of the free world, thinking he could make it bend to his menacing ways. But he badly miscalculated.